WABE in Atlanta. This is Savory Stories, a show where we take a look at Atlanta's people through its cuisine and food history.
On this podcast, we trace Atlanta's food story from the past to the present, getting to know Atlanta's culinary creators and demystifying stereotypes about food.
I'm Akilah McConnell, culinary historian and owner of Unexpected Atlanta Tours, the #1 rated Atlanta tour and activity on TripAdvisor.
And I'm Chef Asata Reed, owner of Life Chef, where we help you live a life you love, and author of How to Feed a Kid a Parent's Guide. Today, we are focused on some interesting neighborhoods in Atlanta's historical West Side, including West End, Cascade Heights, and my neck of the woods, Westview. And to really delve into the story of this area, we are excited to welcome our first guest host to the podcast.
That is right. I'm so excited to introduce Victoria Lemos, local historian and the host of the Archive Atlanta podcast, joining us. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you for having me. I didn't know I was the first guest host.
Yes.
You are the first.
A lot of pressure, but I'm very honored.
So Victoria and I, we've known each other for many years. Our text message chain is a little funny because it's always like, hey, have you seen this random history note here? We love geeking out on all things Atlanta history. But Victoria, for those who don't know you, would you give us just a brief intro on who you are and how you got into the local historian gig?
Sure. So I'm a born and bred New Yorker. I admit it up front, but I moved to Atlanta about 18 years ago, and everyone's always like, oh, well, you into history? And I think I kind of was, but generally the overarching theme is I'm obnoxiously curious. And so, I had bought my books, my 3 or 4 books, and my joke is like the 3 topics Atlanta talks about, which is Civil War, Gone with the Wind, and MLK. That's it.
That's it. That's all
That's
there
it.
is.
That's all we got.
That's all we've got in this city. That's it.
Maybe some Coca-Cola, So I had read those, and I come down here, and, I just started going on some local tours. And I remember just, again, being really curious and exploring. I'm like, well, what about this building? What about this neighborhood? Well, what about this place? And a lot of people are like, I don't know. We don't go over there. So just for me, not having the answers, I taught myself how to research, and then I just started subjecting friends and family to unsolicited history bits all the time. I could see their eyes rolling. And I'd be like, did you know? So about 5.5 years ago, I started an Atlanta history podcast, and that has been one of just a blessing really for me, just like the people it's connected me to and the things I've been able to learn and the things I've been able to share.
I can't believe it's been 5.5 years.
Me neither, because we talked when I first started.
We did.
Yeah.
And I told Victoria, I was like, this is so needed. I am so excited about this, because the other thing is that Victoria has this background in architecture and homes and real estate, and that really comes through in her podcast. So, yay.
That's amazing. I love it. So, Victoria, I hear you're a fan of the Westview neighborhood. That's my stomping ground, and I have my reasons why I love it. But coming from your background, what are some of yours?
Yeah, so for me as the history nerd, I'm always drawn to places in Atlanta that tend to be forgotten or blended in. And I think that happens with Westview because the West End really dominates. Mm-hmm. Westview's fairly small, and it's mostly residential. You have a little bit of that strip of, on Ralph David Abernathy. So for me, I love pointing out places that some Atlantans might be passing through and might not be able to really stop and realize it's there.
Little hidden gems.
Hidden gems,
yeah.
I love that. And I think Westview itself, it has this really interesting history that's very different from a lot of Atlanta's other historic neighborhood. As we've talked about in the past, much of Atlanta's history is associated with transportation and the railroads. But in Westview's case, the story of the neighborhood has more to do with the cemetery, right? Is the cemetery important, and what does it have to do with our city's food history?
Yeah, so it is still transportation related, which I joke, can't get away with Atlanta being transportation related, but it's definitely centered around Westview. So Westview Cemetery, the land is purchased in 1884. At this point, we had been burying people in what is Oakland Cemetery today. We're full. And the city really needed more land, and so essentially makes a deal with a bunch of private individuals to run a private cemetery with the agreement that they were going to make some room for indigent burials and Black burials as well. well.
And Chinese burials.
And Chinese burials, which is funny. I actually associate the Chinese burial grounds with Greenwood. But yes, that site itself was the site of a Civil War battle where over 3,500 men died. And it actually remains today the largest cemetery in the Southeast. So it's the 1880s. This becomes the place to be buried. You have families like the Candlers and the Woodruffs being buried there. But it's actually still the final resting place for modern people that we know. Rhea Pell of Rhea's Bluebird, and very, very recently, Rico Wade of Organized Noise was buried there as well.
Yeah, and as cemeteries go, it's really beautiful. My grandmother, Georgia, is also buried there, so I've spent some time visiting. And that Abbey Chapel, let's talk about that. That is absolutely picturesque. And a lot of TV shows have been shot over there and major films. Of course, many of them are dark and creepy because that's why you shoot in in a cemetery. I think Vampire Diaries is probably the one everybody can just really see it and identify. But Ozark has shot there, and a lot of the Marvel movies, if they have a cemetery set, it's over there in Westview. So there's a fun fact. Folks hold events there to this day because that abbey is just so stunning. But let's go back to our history lesson, Akilah. Let's take us back to the 1800s.
Yeah, so, Victoria, in the late 1800s, there weren't really any restaurants. So I pulled back that research and I didn't find any restaurants in the Westview neighborhood. And that's because it wasn't a residential neighborhood.
That's right.
You don't normally go to restaurants at a cemetery, right? So when did it become a residential neighborhood?
That's right. And it's funny. You're one of the best researchers I know as well. So I'm like, well, if Akilah didn't find something, I was like, I'm not going to find it. But I also looked, and really, this isn't a place where people are living quite yet. So a lot of people would take their wagons or their carriages out to Westview and they would pack a lunch. A lot of people were picnicking in Westview the same way that they did at Oakland. But it's really when the streetcar comes. So this is when we get to that transportation connection. To get people out to the cemetery in 1886, the West End and Atlanta Streetcar Company runs a line down today's Ralph Daybert Abernathy. So just 2 years later, the Ontario Land Company purchases 200 acres along this path to develop a residential neighborhood. Make a long story short, they had some financial difficulties. They ended up selling the land to another developer. That doesn't really start taking place until the 1910s. So by 1914, there are 600 homes in the Westview neighborhood. And by 1921, the area has been annexed into the city of Atlanta.
I think we should make a quick food point right here, which is you just heard Victoria say that people used to take their picnic baskets out to Westview and to Oakland as well. And that might sound insane from our current standpoint. Nobody's packing up a picnic to go to a cemetery usually. But it wasn't so uncommon. It was the place. That was where you would go.
People do not realize, I think we tend to forget a time when there wasn't a botanical garden that existed.
That's right. Piedmont Park was not established until the late 1800s. So after Westview, after Oakland.
Exactly. And so people don't think about that today. I think we take parks for granted. But this was like, wait a second, there's some dead people here, but there's also hundreds of acres of green space. And so you very much would just pack up your stuff and spend the whole day there. Also think about how hard it was to get there. You know, you weren't just driving, you were taking a very long carriage ride. And so you were really kind of packing up to spend the whole day.
The other thing, too, I think that's important to think about from both the perspective of Westview and Oakland is that these were in the outskirts of the city. You know, today we're like, oh, West End, that's just right there. Yeah, well, that's because we have cars.
And highways. It's just 10 minutes down I-20, right?
I laugh about that a lot because, you know, the ITP, OTP discussion, such a big topic. And I try to put people in perspective. I'm like, you know, at one point, like the Fox Theater area of Peachtree Street was way OTP. That was like the you know, oh my gosh, I can't believe what happens out there. And so it's really interesting to step back and go, you know, we're just living in a different time. OTP has different connotations for us now, but that was way far away. Like you said, it was like, why would I live out here?
And at that time, I don't think Westview was nearly at capacity that it is now. And it still has room for additional bodies.
And it was huge. Like Victoria just said, I mean, this is a massive cemetery, tons of green space.
Okay, so just do a time check real quick. In reality, this is a historic community, but it's only been a true neighborhood for the past 100 years or so. And we know that 100 years ago, Atlanta was strictly segregated. So was Westview a white neighborhood or a black neighborhood?
This was strictly a white neighborhood, and that doesn't really change until post-World War II Atlanta. In that time, Atlanta's population booms, and the city is dealing with an extreme housing shortage. It's really a national story, the housing shortage, but because in Atlanta we were trying to be strictly segregated, it's even more dire. And so it's not really until the 1960s, late 1960s, that this area is going to shift from being exclusively white to exclusively black.
Okay, but before we get there, let's talk about the food. I keep on bringing it back to the food, right? So up until the 1950s to 1960s, what were some of the standout restaurants and food stories about this neighborhood?
So I did try to dive into that retail strip that we're going to talk about. And I do know that there were at least 2 soda shops in the 1920s. And a soda shop is going to be just that. So if you know the early history of Coca-Cola, you had to go to the soda shop to get your carbonation mixed in with the syrup. I'm sure they had candies. Maybe they had some sandwiches. There was something that was considered a lunchroom. Not a lot more information that is actually in the current slutty vegan space, which is kind of cool. And there was a small grocery store as well that I'm assuming people got maybe some lunches from there. One of the most famous places, if you talk to residents from the 1940s and 50s, and they eventually moved, but even into the 60s, was the Teddy Bear Grill.
Yeah, and the Teddy Bear Grill is pretty interesting. I don't know if you've heard this story before. It was actually a small local franchise or local chain where the owner set it up. And you would think Teddy Bear Grill, this would be like warm and cozy and family friendly. It was more of a adult destination.
Really?
Yes.
That is not what I pictured.
It was not so. It was like you would go there, hang out, shoot pool, drink beers. Like there were apparently, I pulled numerous incidents of crime, and we've
Probably some fancy ladies.
some fancy ladies. Yes, yes. So
Okay,
it was
that kind of not at all because
Not
I
Teddy
did
Bear.
not. Yes, not Teddy.
different type of cuddly. Different type of cuddly. So where have we to eat now in the West?
Well, today, Westview is home to some of Atlanta's iconic eats. As Victoria mentioned, let's start with the Slutty Vegan. This is one of the earlier locations of the vegan burger chain. There are now 10, and it's growing and turning into a franchise. The owner, Pinky Cole Hayes, she's like an Atlanta icon at this point. Legendary for her explosive success after introducing those scandally titled meat-free versions of fast food favorites to Atlanta. Oh, rumor has it she became a millionaire within 6 months of opening, which is mind-blowing. But what she's really famous for, besides busting burgers, is her philanthropy. She gives back to Atlanta and Atlanta's people. The Pinky Cole Foundation has paid off college debt for students at Clark Atlanta University and provided college scholarships to the children of Rayshard Brooks, who was fatally shot by police in June of 2020. She has also offered former juvenile offenders jobs in her restaurants and college scholarships as well. Our girl is big on education, okay? But let's go back to the 1970s because that's when the neighborhood shifted, right?
So yes, most of Atlanta's white flight was completed, quote unquote, by the 1970s. But I do like to point out something that I learned and I've changed in the way I describe it. It wasn't like an overnight thing, right? It wasn't like one day white families woke up and fled to the suburbs. There were several decades where first a lot of white residents used some racial terror and violence to scare away Black people from moving into their neighborhoods. And then there was about 2 decades where Atlanta's civic leaders spent time trying to enact these racial buffer zones. And one of these, Westview Drive, which is actually at the top end of Westview, was one of those proposed lines. And so as Atlanta's population again gets larger and larger and Black Atlantans grow more vocal about their rights to live where they pleased, it was really then that white Atlantans moved out.
Wait, hold on. What's a racial buffer line? Because some of our listeners might never have heard of that before.
Yeah. So this is a lot under the administration of William Hartsfield. And this is really a biracial coalition. So, a lot of people hear that term, the Atlanta Way. This is kind of the definition of the Atlanta Way, which is white elected politicians talking to Black community leaders, so business owners, real estate board presidents, and together they were having these meetings and they were trying to quote unquote figure out what to do, right? Like, well, okay, how about this? How about we decide that Black people are going to stay to this side of this road and white people will stay here? And they tried these for several years and it kind of worked until, again, one family would buy the one house on the wrong side of the street. There was so many instances of Klan members coming out to these houses, burning crosses in their yards. And that's really where the Black leaders that were coming into these meetings really stopped, compromising. They were just like, we're not doing this whole thing. We're not going to do it anymore. And so that is when you saw that true white flight. That's when DeKalb County gets very populated by white families at the time. And really, sometimes I think that story still happens, right? And again, we're just expanding further and further out. The definitions are changing, but that story still repeats itself.
Absolutely. I think what's really interesting in what you said is Westview and West End, that's butting right up to Atlanta University Center. This is the center of Black education in the entire Southeast. And there's an arbitrary line that's being drawn and said, hey, y'all can go get educated over here, but you can't live across the street over here.
And what's even more interesting that people don't realize is if you go back to early West End history, so the West End in itself, right, is older than Atlanta. It was its own city. But before it became the West End, it was just called Whitehall, and it included the Atlanta University Center, and it stretched even further down. And it's really the marketing that happens in the 1870s where white real estate developers come in, and again, they got to make some changes. And so if you look at the demographics, I think there was 620 people in this proposed area. 300 of them were Black. Can't have that if we're going to sell lots to white people. So they, cut it up, made it smaller, named all of the streets after Confederate veterans, right? Very detailed, deliberate marketing to say, hey, white people, come buy these lots. And that's what the West End originally was. They were these grand estates. Most of them had 5 to 10 acres each. Most of them were retired Civil War generals and colonels and people like that. And it became again, very picturesque, garden-like neighborhood of big estates.
Love that. Let's talk a little bit about what the West End is like today, because some of these buildings that you're talking about, they're still standing and they're being used for different purposes, right, Asada?
That's true. The strip along Ralph David Abernathy and the houses off the main strip all have a lovely historical aesthetic that, let's admit, Atlanta kind of lacks in general. You would think this city popped out of the ground in the 1970s, 1950s max. And I'm always joking that Atlanta has been rebuilding since the Civil War because we will tear down a historical building in a heartbeat to throw up some condos.
Yeah, that's my line is Atlanta has a grand tradition of tearing things down. That's our tradition.
Now, in that strip along Ralph David Abernathy, there's several eateries and businesses, including a tattoo shop and one of my favorite breakfast haunts, Augie's. I was talking with my stepson, Kyle. Big shout out to Kyle, K-Dog, the other day, and he was like, when you're a foodie, going out to breakfast just doesn't make sense. And I agree, because I can make bacon, eggs, and biscuits at home. Am I right?
Of course you are. And you know what? We love biscuits so much. We got a whole episode all about biscuits. If you want to learn how to make the proper biscuits, you can come and take a tour with Unexpected Atlanta. But Augie's Biscuits?
Yeah, Augie's is different. The restaurant is dedicated to music, specifically soul music, and the walls are lined with old photos of some of the greats like Tina Turner, Earth, Wind & Fire, Shaka Khan, you get it. It's a Black-owned establishment with a really small dining room, so brunch, you already know, is a line situation. And the menu items are familiar songs. Now, none of that is reason enough to go out for breakfast, but the Never Can't Say Goodbye, yeah, featuring Belgian waffles with berries and 3 whole fried chicken wings. Whole fried chicken wings is definitely a reason to go out for breakfast. My reason to get up and put on some clothes is you're the one I want. You're the one I want. Ooh, ooh, ooh. It's fried catfish, the whole fillet, over the dreamiest grits with a creamy, spicy Parmesan sauce. I always get a side of over easy eggs, and I'm a truly happy girl. I will leave my house for that breakfast. And if you're not on the west side, you can also visit the new Augie's location. It's on Caroline Street in Edgewood, downstairs from Roussan's.
love that. That sounds delicious. You're making me want to go there and eat. But there's also some great grocery stores, right, over there in Westview too, right? Like Westview Corner Grocery.
Which is so adorable and really, really plugged into the community. It's a locally owned natural food store, and they have an extensive offering of wines and local beers, too. The signage out front reads Thrift Town, spelled Thriftown, so it's not two different words. And I'm guessing it's in an old grocery store. Victoria, what do you know about that building?
The fun fact is, I think it's been a grocery store its whole life, and it opened in 1949 as a Kroger.
Ooh,
a little baby
Kroger.
Baby
compared to the
Kroger.
city center on the other side of Ralph David Abernathy now.
And I actually found this full page advertisement of other baby Krogers that I'm about to actually, after this, probably drive around and see if these buildings are still here, because I also felt the same. I was like, baby Kroger. And it seems to be a Kroger through the 1950s, and then becomes a food town, and then Thrift Town, which was also a grocery store. At some point, Kroger, it was a subsidy of Kroger. So Kroger came back into the picture, at least legally, but this is in the 70s. So I don't know what its, maybe 80s and 90s story was, but I love that it's a grocery store again.
That's amazing.
It's
Baby
a great
Kroger.
and it's a great
that.
place to shop. The manager there, I mean, they have a rewards program, and at some point he just knows your name and number, and he's just like plugging you in. It's just the kind of old school vibe where you'd get in and just start chatting with people in the aisles. So let's zoom out a little bit. We've been hanging out over here in Westview. Let's take another look at another West Side neighborhood a little bit further down Cascade Road. I could literally jump in my car, roll down the hill on Beecher Street, and arrive at Cascade Heights. So many things happening over there. Victoria, can you give us a little history on that era?
Yeah, it is my favorite neighborhood in Atlanta, and most of the people that live there are like, shh.
Right.
Because I feel not enough people understand how incredible it is. First is that Cascade Road has a indigenous history to it. Most scholars have figured out it is part of the Sandtown Trail, or an offshoot of the Sandtown Trail, which was used by the Muskogee. So the road itself is historic. It, again, was sparsely populated, mostly just larger estates. So it's really in the 1920s that this gets developed as a formal neighborhood. And I tell people all the time, if you know Morningside's pretty popular, right? Everyone likes it, the houses. It's the same exact housing stock. It is the same architects. It's the same builders. It's just that this neighborhood has a different trajectory. So, if you drive around Adams Park, Cascade Heights, on Cascade Road, those houses are gorgeous. The lots are huge. They have a beautiful park. And they have that, again, kind of like Westview, that little small retail area that has some really exciting shops. So that's why I'm always like talking about it, and people that live there are like, stop.
Well, let's talk about the beautiful, because this is an Atlanta soul food institution. It's a place where celebrities, politicians like to meet, but it also has a really interesting story, and that story has to do with the Perfect Church. So, Victoria, tell us a little bit about that Perfect Church.
Yeah, so the Perfect Church decided to open up businesses associated with the church in the mid-1970s. They opened up 6 dry cleaners and laundries, but they were too time-consuming and not really profitable. So it's 1979 that they opened the beautiful restaurant on Cascade, and they operated 3 restaurants, a 7-unit apartment building, a school, a grocery store, and a strip mall, with about 50% of their employees as church members. And the goal is to be sufficient and independent to themselves.
And I think that's so interesting to think about, that this is basically a self-contained economic unit. They're saying, we're going to be a church, and we're going to also supply jobs to our members. Really interesting. So what would we be eating at the beautiful restaurant today, Asada?
Back in the day when they first opened up, they were trying to meet the health requirements of the cooks. So they offered healthy food that was in contrast to fast food, like McDonald's. So they had a lot of things that were low salt, and they didn't use pork. That has changed, because I can tell you the double thick, deep fried pork chop that I had smothered in gravy was fantastic the last time I was at the beautiful. The decor hasn't changed much, even if the menu has. So you'll still find all that vinyl burgundy seats and the buffet table. In 2022, the beautiful restaurant received a grant from the city of Atlanta when Mayor Andre Dickens announced the Resurgence Grant to help revitalize neighborhoods like Cascade Heights.
So the beautiful kind of marks this delineation in Cascade Heights, right? So there's now this other location called The Point. Is that right, Asada?
Yeah, they're having a little revitalization moment here. The strip mall, this is the same strip mall, now has all these cute little shops, Spice House and Aretha's at The Point. These are two places you definitely want to check out. Spice House is Caribbean fusion with really good vibes. And what I like to call is white tablecloth cuisine, because it can slide into sort of a sophisticated club speakeasy vibe in after hours. Great for date night, brunch, girls' night out, all of that. Culinary influences come from Haiti and Jamaica, quite strong here, and they have other locations in Buckhead, Midtown, and Lithonia. Next, I want to point out Aretha's at The Point.
And I know you love this restaurant.
I love this restaurant.
So tell us all about it.
So it's named after chef owner Deborah Von Treese's mother, and we love Deborah Von Treese. She's also the owner of Twisted Soul. She is the queen of fine dining Southern style. Let's put it that way. This is a white tablecloth Southern soul food restaurant presented in some of the most thoughtful and delicious ways I've seen. Under the helm of executive chef Christian Bell, Aretha's presents an elegant menu, an expert wine list, and smart cocktails alongside a menu that reflects seasonality. So you don't just eat at Aretha's, you dine. You have an experience. And for me, this is definitely a special occasion destination or a place to take visitors when they're from out of town.
Victoria, she's got me convinced.
I know, me too. I was sitting here.
I was like, man, let's go. I
was imagining eating there as she was talking, so it's working.
Well, religion, we talked about religion with the Perfect Church and setting up the beautiful, but the religion also played a super big role in the establishment of another longtime Westview favorite, and that is Soul Vegetarian.
Such an OG right there.
Victoria, can you tell us a little bit about the Black Hebrews and their relationship to Soul Vegetarian?
Sure. So founded by Black Hebrews, members of the original Hebrew Israelite nation of Jerusalem, the goal of the restaurant was to help build a community for Black Hebrews. They established Soul Vegetarian in 1979, first in Midtown, but soon opened up a location in the neighboring West End neighborhood, just a mile away from the beautiful restaurant.
Is that really only a mile? There's so much food and history between these two iconic locations. Soul Veg was the first place I had kale bone, which is like seitan. And their ginger root drink is world famous. If it's not, it should be. If you even think you have the sniffles, this potent ginger drink is going to kick whatever ails you right out. There are a lot of vegetarian restaurants in Atlanta, so why did Soul Vegetarian become a West End icon?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's interesting because while they say they're vegetarian, back in the day, they actually considered themselves vegan, which is also interesting. But when they opened up Soul Vegetarian, they specifically said that they were, and I quote, "not here to make money. We're here to show the community how to eat." At the time, they were the only purveyor of soy ice cream, which was the very first non-dairy ice cream served in the city of Atlanta.
They really were on the forefront of the healthy food trend, even way back then.
Yes. Like the Perfect Church, the members of the original Hebrew Israelite nation of Jerusalem combined business work with their religious efforts. And so although, like Akila said, the door said vegetarian, this really was vegan. And they didn't use sugar, salt, or milk, or eggs in any of the food's preparations. Spurred on by the success of the restaurant, they opened up a clothing store that sold robes worn by Black Hebrews.
So one thing that's really interesting that we're seeing as a theme throughout this episode is the fact that religion really played a role in creating these restaurants and restaurant types, even like vegan cuisine. Why is that, Victoria?
So I have to refer here, my friend and journalist Ann Hill Bond is working on a piece about the myriad of groups that worship in the West End. It's not always formal religion, it can just be spirituality. But within a 3-mile radius of Ralph David Abernathy, there are 30 modern/Western traditional places of worship, meaning Catholic, Christian, Baptist, Muslim, etc. And then there are countless third spaces, like places that mainstream society may not consider a traditional place of worship. Somewhere quietly in a West End home somewhere, there are chats and prayers to reverence Buddhism, African traditional religions, and Rastafarians. If you think about someone like Mr. Nee with the Nation of Islam, he stands on Lee Street selling bean pies to generate income for himself and his mosque. And it's something that I said earlier about buildings being repurposed, which is what I love the most about the West End. If you look at the Shrine of the Black Madonna, they moved onto Ralph David Abernathy in 1975, but into a building that was built in 1940 as the Gordon Theater, which was a very segregated white movie house for the population of West End at the time. And the shrine itself was founded as the 9th congregation of the Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church, which was actually started by the father of Pearl Clegg.
Super
Crazy. Cool. I feel like this is a full circle moment. Soul Veg has been serving vegetarian food, well, vegan food since forever in the West End. And now Slutty Vegan is in the mix with vegetarian, well, really vegan food over in Westview. Now, further up Cascade from Soul Vegetarian is a cute spot known for its smoothies and fresh juices. This is Wadada Healthy Market and Juice Bar, and it is yet another Black-owned establishment in the West End that's also a natural foods market. Wadada is Atlanta's first woman-owned, Black-owned, vegan grocery store and juice bar. Wadada claims that over 90% of their products and vendors are also Black-owned businesses, and that their juice bar ingredients are all natural, organic, and locally sourced. And as of April 2024, they have celebrated their 5th anniversary, kind of making them the new kid on the block, but I'm glad they survived through the pandemic.
That is amazing. You know, we just talked about Faith, right? But Faith also played a role in one of the hottest restaurants on the West End and maybe in Atlanta today. You'll know what I'm talking about already. That's Tassili's Raw Reality, founded by Tassili Mott, a faith-based healing practitioner and Kundalini yoga instructor. So let's dish about Tassili's.
Akila, I feel like I had a front row ticket watching the evolution of Tassili's Raw Reality. Maybe like 100 years ago, I worked at and was a member of Seven Nanda's Natural Food Store. I can remember when Tassili was supplying specialty items for their cold case. In particular, her kale salad was a showstopper. Now, consider that foreshadowing, right? Then Tassili's food was the talk of the town at pop-up events and various catered events, and eventually she opened Tassili's Raw Reality to much anticipation. I mean, the lines. The trend continues to this day, which has encouraged a thriving sidewalk market, especially on the weekends, of makers and wellness workers who offer everything from jewelry to massages outside the restaurant doors. And I love that because it's like a almost impromptu community market that happens there.
It's like that third space.
It is.
It is that
People
third
are
space.
just drawn there. And so now like independent commerce is happening in the building, outside the building. And her dedication to holistic wellness has spilled out of the doors of her restaurant and literally onto the streets of Atlanta's West End community. And it's a beautiful thing to take part in. But back to the food. Okay, we've all eaten it. What makes this food Insta-pop worthy? The kale wraps. Remember that kale salad? It has evolved into something heavenly.
And, you know, I think we should just give a small description of these kale wraps, because if you were thinking that this is like, you know, a meager,
like little
tiny
burrito
thing,
size.
You don't use the word small.
At all. The first word that comes to my mind is actually huge.
You literally need two hands.
It's a two-handed.
It's not a one biter too. Like you're taking a bite out of half of it.
You're taking a bite to get a bite.
You're taking a bite, and the kale starts to come out, and you're like, no,
you're taking a bite
not
just to get into the thing. They are huge, and they are delicious. And I think the Punani and Mandingo wraps are the two top sellers, and they're literally a meal for two.
Agreed. So like you said, Asada, there is so much great food and history in the West End, and we have just scratched the surface by taking a look at some great neighborhoods like Westview and Cascade Heights and West End. There's so much more to discover.
And a special thanks to our guest host, Victoria Lemos. Where can our listeners find you and learn more about Archive Atlanta?
Thank you. So the podcast is available wherever you listen to podcasts. But you can also follow Archive Atlanta on Instagram and Facebook for more detailed history posts about building and houses across Atlanta.
We will be back in a few weeks with a new episode. See you then.
Savory Stories is produced by Crystal Devone and Kevin Rinker, with additional production and editing from Scotty Crow. The series was created by Summer Evans and premiered on City Lights with Lois Reitzes. For more info, visit wave.org/Savory Stories.
WABE.